Well, welcome everyone. We are organizing this special panel as part of AAS-in-ASIA conference, which is presently being held in Delhi, co-hosted by Association of Asian Studies and Ashok University. And we were invited to organize a special panel. We thank both AAS and Ashok University for giving us this opportunity. And of course, a big thank you to India International Center, who are our partners in this event. As first note, we are really delighted to have so many friends present here, especially when we are competing with 6 parallel sessions at this point of time. And more importantly, quarter-final match of World Cup, which starts at 7:30. Many friends have threatened to leave at 7 o'clock. They don't want to miss their match. I think this is because of, as Mr. Shivshankar just told me, a very fabulous special panel we managed to put together. We have with us Ambassador Saran, Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, and Dr. Jabin. I don't really need to introduce them, but for benefit of some friends from AAS fraternity who are here, Ambassador Saran, eminent diplomat, public servant, scholar, author. He was a former foreign secretary, Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Climate Change and Nuclear Negotiations. He is currently, more importantly for us, in ICS, member of our governing council, and also life trustee, India International Center. Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, another stalwart from diplomatic community of India, someone who has made his imprint in different assignments, including as National Security Advisor of India, Foreign Secretary, Ambassador of India to China, and so many other assignments. He is currently, and he did guide in that, Chairman of Advisory Board of Institute of Chinese Studies. Jabin, again part of ICS family. He was until recently fellow with us. He is currently Associate Editor of China Report, which is quarterly academic journal brought out by ICS. What I planned initially was to request 3 panelists to make brief opening statements, but they have just vetoed me. They decided that it will be a purely conversational event without any set-piece presentations. What we propose to do over next 90 minutes or so is to discuss India's China policy in the larger context of what's happening in the region and globally. We will take stock of where we stand in our relations today and what kind of future directions we envisage moving ahead. We have posed a set of 5 questions to the panel. One will be discussing some of the defining features of the global situation and how it impacts India-China relations. As you know, we are today witnessing a period of particular uncertainty and disruption in the international environment. Earlier today, USA imposed a 25% tariff on imports worth $34 billion from China, and China retaliated immediately with a similar tariff on similar amount of imports from USA. And President Trump has suggested that the amount targeted would go up to as much as $500 billion, which is incidentally total US imports from China. This is more about, this is not just about trade. I think what we're witnessing is in a way emblematic of a growing strategic rivalry between USA and China. And it's not just disruption involving China and USA. In fact, this is something much wider because USA has imposed tariff on imports from other partner countries as well. We are witnessing unpredictability associated with US policies. We're witnessing concerns about increasingly assertive behavior of China. There is a retreat from globalization, a whole lot of other developments. So we'll have the panel discussing those developments and see how those developments influence India's policy towards China. Second question that has been posed to the panel is what's the current state of our relations with China post-Wuhan, post-Qingdao. Thirdly, we'll look at structural challenges in our relations with China. Fourthly, we will explore if there is a need for a new modus vivendi in our engagement with China, and if so, what can be possible elements of the recalibrated paradigm for engagement that we seek to develop with that country. And finally, we'll discuss the future trajectory of development relations with China. So I'll start with a set of questions first, posed to Ambassador Shyam. So if we look at the current global scene, I referred to some of the elements of uncertainty and disruption. How will you characterize the situation, especially in terms of bearing it has on our engagement with China?
Thank you very much, Ashok. With respect to the features of the current global situation, I think you have already mentioned several important I think it is important to perhaps realize that some of the changes that we are seeing in fact represents not immediate departures from the past, but perhaps an acceleration of some of the trends we have already seen in evidence for quite some time. So, for example, we have been talking for quite some time about the shift in the center of gravity of the global economy from the transatlantic to the trans-Pacific. I think it would be fair to say that after the last G7 summit, I think that has become even more stark because whatever remnants of Western alliance that we had been used to as a very stable and abiding element in the global landscape, that has been very badly shaken. And the contrast with what happened in Europe and immediately followed by what we saw in Singapore, the summit between the North Korea and President Trump. That, in a sense, represented a very major change in that landscape that I also, with regard to the globalization of our economies, again, a trend that has been in evidence for quite some time. There is a reaction to it, although I believe that globalization as a trend can be perhaps slowed down, but I do not think it can be reversed. But we are in a phase where there is a pushback on the forces of globalization, and the country which was perhaps the biggest champion of globalization, and in a sense its custodian, the United States of America, itself has become the greatest threat to that system. So I think what countries like India, China, Russia and others are reacting to is not only change that was already in evidence, but number one, a sudden acceleration of that change. And the fact that some of at least some stable elements which were still there are also being shaken by the developments which are taking place. So, all across the world, I think the term that we use is hedging. Everybody is trying to make certain that you cover as many flanks as possible as you go ahead, because you never know what is going to happen. With the next tweet that you will get from President Trump. So this is a phase which probably is going to endure for some time. But I think I also, to end this analysis, I also feel that it is perhaps only in phases of change and phases of transition that also spaces are created for emerging countries like India to actually to expand their own diplomatic skills. So I would also say, rather than be entirely defensive in terms of dealing with this situation, perhaps there might be merit in looking at what are some of the opportunities that have opened up, what are the windows which have opened up, which would actually enable India to expand its own space or profile in the world. How do we do that? But that's it.
If I can turn to Ambassador Menon for the next question. One most remarkable aspect of the present situation is unorthodox policies pursued by President Trump. There are people who are suggesting that the USA is in retreat from alliance system, from global commitment in general. Others who suggest that it's not a retreat, but what President Trump is trying to do is to redefine terms of engagement with allies, with friends, with potential adversaries. So how would you like to look at, define President Trump's attitude towards USA's global commitment, Pax Americana, to what extent it survives, and how do you see it developing? Is it something unique flowing out of Donald Trump's predilections, or is it reflective of a larger change taking place in US world?
Like Trump, I don't think this is pure Trump. I think it's actually an accentuation of trends we've seen before that started crossing the Obama administration. With less willingness to commit abroad. Now it's reached the point where there is unwillingness to maintain the liberal world order, so-called liberal, but it's not really liberal, or to provide the global public goods, or to maintain the institutions which ran the US order, which maintained US hegemony, as it were, whether it's any of the multilateral institutions, and even on the security commitments with NATO, with the other allies in Asia. But it's not only now. If you look at the reaction of countries in the Asia-Pacific for the last decade or so, we've undergone the world's greatest arms race in history. Why? Because of the uncertainty. Because nobody is quite sure what is happening, and because of the rise of China. We saw China rising. And each one, and these are offensive weapons that you've seen in this region, throughout the Asia-Pacific, submarines, missiles, and so on. Secondly, there is no global balance anymore. There is no central global balance. If you look at the world today, it's multipolar economically. The Chinese have caught up with the Americans, overtaken them according to some measures. But militarily, the US still spends more than the next 7 countries put together, and has a huge military dominance, predominance, and over everybody else. And there really isn't, nobody's catching up with them. And so there's complete political and strategic confusion. I mean, each of the balances is actually broken down into local balances. You look at the Korea issue, you look at Northeast Asia, it's bipolar with very strong regional powers. Whether it's bipolar between China and the US, they try and settle it themselves, but they can't because the regional powers, Japan, South Korea, North Korea, have their own issues. South Asia, it's a three-body problem, or more likely 2.5. I mean, it's India, China, and when the US is interested, which is, she seems less and less interested, she's involved. You look at Southeast Asia, it's bipolar but tending towards China, because frankly the US isn't there, isn't present at all. Either in military terms or in commercial terms. When's the last time you saw an American car anywhere, or an American commercial president? So the balance has shifted. Nobody's quite sure where we are. So we're not just hedging, we're hedging, balancing, doing everything, internal balancing, external balancing, all at the same time. So this is not just Trump. And I think we should get used to this. This is the new normal. And Xi Jinping says so also. So I think we really should get used to this and get used to living in a world like this. As Shyam said, we are not a status quo power. We never have been, not from the beginning. This is not our order. And this order was not designed for our benefit. So frankly, we shouldn't sit here bemoaning the end of the old order, nor should we make strategic stability our goal. We should look at what we can get out of this for India, to transform India, how we can actually, how this can help us to do our job at home. And there are opportunities. I agree with Shyam that there are huge opportunities. But the other point you asked, Shyam, how does this affect India-China relations? My own sense is that the international context, if you look at it throughout, has influenced India-China relations but doesn't drive it. That India-China relations have a dynamic of their own, which is primarily internal to India, to China, to what India and China seek out of the system, and is also driven by the region and by the issues that they deal with. Today we have a very different situation from the past, but those are much more important to me as drivers of the relationship than what happens at the global scale and how does the international order work.
When you look at the present situation, I have one more question for you. You know, President Xi Jinping has stated on more than one occasion that it's a period of strategic opportunity for China. The recent, Central Foreign Affairs Conference, once again, though he didn't quite use the term strategic opportunity, he maintained basically that it's a historic juncture for China in terms of realization of 2nd century goals. There's clear, coalescing of China's leadership ambitions, regional and global. To what extent it's deriving from this changing world order, reduced commitment on the part of the USA to provide global public goods. How does China look at it? And to what extent it encourages a more assertive behavior on the part of China?
Some of it is certainly external opportunity. As the US essentially withdraws, and whichever word you want to use, essentially withdraws, there is space for China. But primarily, I think Chinese confidence comes from what China has done in the last 30 years to build herself up. Today she has the capability to actually use that opportunity. And it's that confidence, which I think you see in these assertions of Chinese primacy, that we're ready to take a leadership role, etc., etc. And even offering the Chinese model to other countries now, since the 1940 Congress. Saying we're a model for other countries' development. That you haven't heard since Mao Zedong was exported revolution. So there is, I think, a confidence here. But to my mind, there's also a sense of urgency. Because this relative moment of advantage and this relative power is not going to last forever. I can go on and on, but for three big reasons. Demography, by 2040, China will have the demography of Japan today, an old country. One child has done its work already. Secondly, there's no guarantee that just because the US withdraws, nobody else is going to do anything. There are other powers rising as well, and most of them in China's periphery. So she has a crowded geography, very different from the US geography. She doesn't have the advantage of pulling back behind the two greatest oceans in the world. She's trying to become a maritime power for the first time in her history, ever. And that's a big transition, and nobody's sure whether she can do it. Thirdly, the economy is reverting to historical mean in terms of growth and so on. So this confidence that she has from the past. So I'm not sure. I mean, you can look at Belt and Road two ways. You can look at it as a huge strategic leap forward, but you know what happened to Great Leap Forward? It could be overreach, it could be stupendous success, like Reform and Open Door, which was also a gamble when it started. So I think, you know, there's different ways of looking at this. My own sense is this is where the drivers come from, internally from China. And she's trying a very complicated transition internally to change the nature of the economy, the structure of the economy, move from reliance on exports. But if she does all the things she said she's going to do in economic reforms in the third plenum in 2013, then frankly the Communist Party's power over the economy goes. Because she'd have to dismantle the financing system, she'd have to, already state-owned enterprises only employ 16% of people in China. Already that level of control, it might be 30% of GDP, but most people in China don't get their salary from the state anymore. So it's shifting, and this is I think this is what's going to drive the relationship. One reason why we got Wuhan, which basically is a truce, saying you go your way, I'll go mine, let's not bother each other, we have other things to do. One reason we got that, I think, is because of these other preoccupations. On both sides, us too.
Jabin, no, you have written a lot about China's Belt and Road initiative. No, I would like to understand from you, what's your assessment of primary drivers of Belt and Road initiative? Are these drivers economic in character, geopolitical in character? Is it meant to advance China's economic agenda in terms of finding new growth engines? How to look at it? That's one. Secondly, looking ahead, you can see that BRI is running into heavy weather in some areas. What kind of prognosis do you make for Belt and Road initiative?
I think the Belt and Road initiative needs to be seen as a whole. It's not that we can expect it to succeed in total or to fail in total. As Ambassador Menon said, this is a function of them having prepared themselves for decades now. If you actually go back a little further, the Belt and Road, prototypes of the Belt and Road were always in place since the Chinese economic reforms started. I mean, we just have to look at the PCIM, for example, which started in 1999. And if anybody actually studied, the relationship between the Chinese central government and its provinces, and how each of these provinces operated somewhat independently to develop economic linkages with their neighbors, one could conceivably have predicted the Belt and Road. And really that is going to be the strength. The Chinese, this is not a new, it is a new framework, it's a new nomenclature, but this sort of builds on existing strengths in China's immediate neighborhood. And they have sort of used this moment, this strategic window, strategic opportunity, call it what you will, to push a grand narrative that goes along with it. So the driver is one, of course, there's economics is the driver. There is overcapacity, that's one part of it. But let's not get taken in only by the infrastructure development aspect of it. This is also a push for selling Chinese ideas, a Chinese way of looking at things, a Chinese model, as Ambassador Menon quoted Xi as saying. And that's really the problem. Now, I'm conscious that I am sitting among very distinguished servants of the Republic. And, that's really the starting point for me of any discussion on India-China relations, which is that we, as a Republic of India, have to be conscious of what we stand for. Along with Trump, along with Xi, there is, we are facing a sort of a crisis in leadership and a crisis in sort of what we stand for, crisis in confidence. And the Chinese are sort of trying to drive into this gap and fill that space with the Chinese model, Chinese wisdom, and so on. And, while we are the weaker country, definitely, in terms of ideas, I don't think India is weak. All we need to be doing is to stand up for what the Republic actually represents, the Republic of India. And this political game, which the Chinese know that we can beat the pants off them on. They can have all the money in the world, but if we win in the idea battle, the idea game, and they know that's not so easy. There's no state that promotes soft power, with the amount of resources that the Chinese state does. And I think that's both their strength, maybe temporarily, but it's also their greatest weakness. So in terms of, yes, they might run into heavy weather, second part of the question. But they are also nimble on their feet. I mean, Rajapaksa went in Sri Lanka, the Chinese renegotiated the contract. And you are back to square one as far as Hambantota is concerned. In Venezuela, Maduro, the Venezuelans owe the Chinese $50 billion. So what are the Chinese doing? The Chinese are also in talks with the opposition in Venezuela. So they've got all their bases covered. So we can't really expect Belt and Road to come crashing in a grand manner. The worry really is about Belt and Road succeeding even in parts, and that would still make it look good. And then we have to ask ourselves the question, what is the Indian alternative in terms of infrastructure development, maybe? But also more importantly, what's the Indian alternative in terms of ideas to what the Chinese are offering?
If I can turn to a different subject, sir, and come back to you. This whole talk about Indo-Pacific, the new construct of Indo-Pacific, which is being discussed. Prime Minister gave an important speech at Shangri-La Dialogue recently, spelling out India's vision of Indo-Pacific. Though he said that it's not a strategy, it's not a club, it's a geographical definition, which is very different from what US Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis had to say, including in terms of what geographic definition we're talking about, from Hollywood to Bollywood, from shores of America to shores of Africa. How do you look at it? Because this is one aspect. People say that has China as the backdrop, desire to balance China is part of the driving force behind so-called free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. How do you look at the subject?
So I think we agreed that there is a lot of hedging going on. So I see, what we have been saying about Indo-Pacific as a bit of running with the hares and hunting with the hounds. And that's okay, because you are faced with a situation where perhaps it is not very wise to take very sort of crystallized positions. But let me also add that I think one, it is very clear to me that as far as India's security interests are concerned, they do suggest a definition of the Indo-Pacific, which is what the Prime Minister talked about, that is stretching from the Western Pacific right up to the eastern shores of Africa. Because for anybody sitting in Delhi, I think that is a China challenge. It is not only a China challenge in the eastern flank, but perhaps it is an even bigger challenge on your western flank. So I don't think that India can have a platform and a CENTCOM. I mean, you need to have a more integrated view of what your security challenge is. So in that sense, the description of this geography from an Indian perspective is the right perspective. However, don't forget that at the same time, there is also a indication that we accept ASEAN centrality as far as any fresh architecture of the Indo-Pacific is concerned, and that you would rely on Asian-led mechanism in order to give expression to an Indo-Pacific architecture. So you have both things in parallel. If you are looking at the latter part, that is more in terms of trying to build up a kind of a coalition that will, hopefully, in your view, provide a greater balance in the and it is in in that context that talk about a quadrilateral, however we may describe it. I think it is, at this stage, it is a bit of flag waving to say, if you don't behave, this is what we can do, the four countries. But confidence and faith in that has, I think, diminished precisely because of the other factors that you mentioned about the unpredictability of the United States system and what Shankar mentioned as the US really in a state of withdrawal. So how do you make something like this work? So I don't think there is any clear idea which these countries have as to what is the best way to go forward. So you keep various things in play and hope for the best as you go along. I think it is good to suggest the rhetoric that whatever we look at in the future as the architecture for the Indo-Pacific, it should be open, it should be inclusive, it should be transparent, it should be balanced. All the different adjectives which have been used, I think, are very worthwhile for us to use as what we see as the main features of that architecture. And the second element, which is of ASEAN centrality. Yes, I know people say ASEAN centrality is a delusion, and it's a myth. Myth it may be, but it's a very useful myth to have. Because if you are saying ASEAN centrality, in a sense you are also suggesting you do not quite accept Chinese centrality. So even that may be oblique, but I think these rhetorical flourishes have a certain value, which I think we should also recognize.
Yeah, I think there's just 2 points. One is, Indo-Pacific, no matter how you define the region, is a limited, it actually concedes the whole continental order to China. You've given up on Eurasia. It's a purely maritime concept. And the problem is today, if you are doing all this to contain China, I mean, on that assumption, then it doesn't make sense. Secondly, the security situation in the Indian Ocean, in the seas near China, which are closed seas, unlike the Indian Ocean, and the Western Pacific, completely different. I mean, in Western Pacific is a US lake. South China Sea today is a Chinese lake. East China Sea is congested, but it's a closed geography. Indian Ocean, even at its height, Pax Britannica never managed to control all 10 choke points at the same time. So, there's fundamental differences. So you can't have one strategy, one security strategy across the whole region. So for me, it's a very limited concept. It's useful, as Shyam says, for flag waving, but it's not going to scare anyone, this flag, at this rate, because it has very limited actual application so far, and the Quad still hasn't come up with a list of concrete things that it's going to do. When it does that, it will be taken seriously, but I don't see that happening right now. So if you look at what Prime Minister Modi said in Shangri-La, it could have been said by any Indian Prime Minister for the last 15 years. And it actually brought us back because it reflects our interests. We've fallen into the habit of saying Suez to Malacca. But less than 15% of our non-oil trade is with Suez to Malacca and the littorals. It's all our real interests are outside that. And if you look at almost half our GDP is external merchandise trade, and most of it, not actually, somewhere a little more than 40% of it goes through the South China Sea. So you have an interest there. And so when you use the word, actually, you should be there defending your interest in open, free maritime trade, in freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, in these areas. I think that's where your interests are today. Because your interests have expanded, so you will talk of the Indo-Pacific of a larger region. But I don't see it today as an immediate sort of security solution to the issues that you face. That you'll have to work with individual partners, whoever, Japan, Vietnam, Australia, Indonesia, Singapore, whoever is willing to.
May I just add that I think what this points to is what Shankar earlier said, that the notion of a overall global balance has, in a sense, partly, what one would say, evaporated. So you have a series of local balances, regional balances, which are coming to the fore. And so in that sense, I agree that as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, it is not taking into account the Eurasian theatre. But I do not think that it is conceding the Eurasian theatre to China. I think the purpose of the Indo-Pacific is a limited regional one. I think we have to look at something else in order to look for a balance in Eurasian theatre. And in that context, also there is some hedging taking place, which is, our membership of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example, which those who are involved in the Quad find rather difficult to accept that you are doing both. But that is, I think, part of the response to the situation that we are facing. And I think there is a recognition, at some level there is a recognition, that going forward, if we are looking at the relationship between Russia and China, I certainly believe that longer term, the interests of Russia and China are not quite aligned. If Russian interests are, the primacy of Russian interests in its neighborhood, that is its Central Asian neighborhood, its East European neighborhood, then the country which is threatening its position in that neighborhood is China. US is not present. Western Europe is so preoccupied with its own problems that in fact you have Eastern Europe sort of drifting away. You have the 16+1 China and East Europe. So I think we should also be conscious of the fact that there is, in that relationship also, there is a opportunity in terms of whatever balance we are looking for going forward. So just to make the point that I do not see that there is even if we work around the Indo-Pacific concept, that I don't see that we have in a sense conceded on the other. We have to very much keep that in focus.
Jabin, you want to say something?
I just wanted to add that while we might think that the concept of Indo-Pacific scares the Chinese, that might not quite be true. Chinese academics have actually talked quite a bit about Indo-Pacific for a long time. And when Chinese academics talk about something, they're either trying to sell the concept to the leadership, or they've been told to sell the concept to the international audience. So, there is actually quite a lot of deep thinking going on. Plus, as Ambassador Menon stated, the Chinese are aware that the Indian Ocean is not being controlled historically by any one power. So, as far as they are concerned, the idea of an Indo-Pacific actually also strengthens, in many ways, their case for being in the Indian Ocean. And so that's something that we need to sort of keep in mind. I would also add that the Indo-Pacific, should not be limited to the Quad. The Quad sort of gives us cover to do a lot of other things. The bilaterals, as was mentioned, but also several trilaterals. These mini balances are something that we need to engage in. And so, Quad is a useful front, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done behind the scenes.
If I can now bring the conversation to how do we look at India-China relations today? Though Mr. Menon described Wuhan as a sort of truce, others have said that Wuhan was essentially a breather. At best, tactical adjustments by two countries. On the other hand, Xi Jinping described Wuhan as a new beginning in India-China relations. I'll ask Shivshankar, what is his take on where we stand today in India-China relations, post-Shyam, post-Wuhan, post-Qingdao?
How many new beginnings have we had in India? So I would not get very excited by that. And I tend to agree with what Shankar said, that I think Wuhan represented something of a truce because of precisely what we were talking in the earlier part of our conversation, that both countries, in a sense, are responding to the new unpredictabilities and new uncertainties around them. It suits both countries at this juncture to, in fact, maintain a reasonably stable if not a friendly relationship. So I think Wuhan did represent a understanding that, perhaps we should lower the temperature. And this is not, by the way, the first time that this has happened. And also that, for example, with respect to the border itself, I see that there has been a diminution in the provocations that we have been talking about at the border. At least this is what we are told. We have had the visit of a very senior PLA general to India. There has been an agreement to resume the friendly exercises that the two militaries were conducting. So there is no doubt that there is an effort being made by both countries to bring the relationship back to some kind of a stable level, which, by the way, prevailed since 2004, 2003, 2004. There was a degree of stability. I look at the change from this standpoint. In 2005, there was a recognition by China that India-China relations, because these are the two largest emerging economies in the world, these are two ancient civilizations which in a sense are re-emerging again. There is a greater interest in India and China working together because their relations have now acquired a global dimension or a strategic dimension. That is, in dealing with many of the challenges which we face, say for example in adjusting some of the existing regime. Shankar talked about, we don't have much of a stake in what order that we inherited. I mean, this liberal order was not something which was aligned with our interests necessarily. Although in some ways we benefited from it. But so there was an interest in trying to together adjust some of these existing regimes so that they are more aligned with the interests of India and China, and also to work together to shape emerging regimes, like in climate change, for example, or looking at some of the other domains. So since we have this larger strategic dimension, it behoves us that we should deal with some of the negative legacy issues in our bilateral relations. Hence, the agreement that we should quickly try to resolve the long-standing boundary issue. That, in fact, began to change after the global financial and economic crisis, where I think China started benchmarking itself with the United States of America, did not see the relationship with India in the same manner as it did, because many of the things you wanted to do with respect to adjusting these various issues, you can do it perhaps better working together with the US. That equation would be much more helpful than this. So in that sense, the salience of India-China relations did push. And this is why you are aware of the fact they would always say our Indian friends should understand that we are now 5 times your size. It cannot be the same as before. So what has happened now is that in some sense we have partly gone back to the earlier consensus, limited and temporary as it may be, that in this particular international situation of unpredictability and uncertainty, there is also now a certain strategic dimension to India-China relations, or a global dimension to India-China relations, that we can deal with these uncertainties better if we work together rather than if we are confronting each other.
So is there any common thread linking Wuhan and Sochi? Yes.
I have no idea. I don't know what happened at either place.
No, in terms of, there are some people suggest that unpredictability associated with the US policies today, encouraging both India and China to show greater flexibility.
As I said, I don't think India-China relations are driven by external context. I don't think Trump is driving India-China relations. I think India-China relations have their own dynamic and their own drivers. And if you look at the signs of stress in the India-China relationship, they are not today or tomorrow or yesterday or just since Trump was elected. I mean, all these, we have this long list of things, NSG, Masood Azhar, you can go on and on. They will say BRI and so on. These predate this problem. The drivers for stress are because I think both of us have expanded our definitions of our interests. And we are rubbing up against each other in the periphery. Today, China's commitment to Pakistan is more than it's ever been before, and questions whether it's the same kind of commitment. After all, once they invest in the CPEC, $62 billion, they're creating a state which they will then defend. They have a stake now in Pakistan occupying your territory, which presumably they will defend. I mean, they're not going to spend that kind of money for nothing. So this changes the situation. You're rubbing up all the way across the periphery because you share this periphery. So the old strategic framework, which you, or modus vivendi if you want to call it, which you basically formalized during Rajiv Gandhi's visit in '88, which was, we discussed the differences, we won't let it stop us doing the normal things. Trade grew, we have 18,000 students in China, and we'll cooperate on the international stage. And that kept the peace, basically, and kept your relationship going for about 30 years. But now, you have multiple signs of stress, you're rubbing up against each other in the periphery, you have a whole set of issues which worry you. You need a new framework. You need to sit down and talk about your core interests, which have grown for both of you. As I said, you are now in the South China Sea, freedom of navigation matters to you. For them, in the meantime, it's become a core issue, a core national interest, etc. I mean, you could go through a whole list of these. You need to sit and look at this and work out a new strategic framework for whether you can. Now, can you work out a framework? Is it going to be easy? No, of course not. I don't know whether you will, but the effort is worth making. Because, frankly, the alternative is that you lose control over the relationship, both sides.
What do you think can be possible elements of this new strategic framework or modus vivendi you are referring to?
Well, the first thing is you go through your core interests. Secondly, you have to have some understanding of how you operate in this periphery that you share. What China does in South Asia matters to you, what she does with your other neighbors. And it's not as though your interests are 100% in conflict. I mean, that's not how it is. You have a relationship where you will both contend and cooperate in various areas across, whether it's the Indian Ocean, whether it's South China Sea, whether it's South Asia. They have an interest in stability in their periphery too. And that, I think, is expressed in various forms, and you can actually work with them. They are among the world's largest mercantile countries and traders. They depend on the Indian Ocean for energy. So they also have vulnerabilities which they want to protect. So for me, this is something but it will take a lot of detailed negotiation on each of these issues and much more communication between the two. But it will be a new framework. It can't be the old one, just a live and let live kind of framework, which is basically what we got, what we survived with. I think now it has to be a much more active engagement on the issues. Two problems with this. One is, you cannot run a kind of foreign security, military policy of engagement unless you're also willing to engage economically and in other spheres. You can't run one policy on trade and economic policy, raise your customs duties, cut yourself off, stay out of RCP or be impossible in the RCP negotiations, and at the same time think I can engage politically, military, not just with China, with everybody else. I mean, it just doesn't look, you don't look credible anymore as an external actor, and especially for ASEAN, this really matters. The other problem is, the rest of the world is not going to, nobody wants to see this happen. Nobody else is going to make this easier for you. So you have to take agency and do it yourself, along with China.
Jabin, what's your take on the structural challenges in India-China relations today? And do you think we need a reset or new paradigm for engaging with China today?
Well, as Ambassador Saran said, there are many new beginnings. We can keep resetting all we want, but structurally, these are two large countries with huge ambitions, expanded interests of their own that are neighbors at the same time. Can't wall themselves off from each other. I think it's a fundamental mistake to assume that India-China relations can sort of get better or reach a level of accommodation or friendliness. I mean, we can be accommodating, but this is not a relationship that can ever reach a this nature of friendly ties that are mentioned in any number of joint statements or was historically something that we promoted. I think the problem is also that China is ruled by the Communist Party of China, and the Communist Party of China under Xi Jinping today is of a particular nature, a particular kind. And if you have trouble understanding what that is about, you just have to look at home. I would say, the BJP and the Communist Party of China are actually very, very similar in their worldviews, in their outlooks. And if you think that in India, that there is a ruling political elite that seeks accommodation with its neighbors, then you should expect the same on the other side. But if you think that's not happening on our side, then why do we expect that to happen on the other side? I think that's the fundamental problem there. In terms of what we can do, structurally, what are the problems? I think despite a large population, we have a very, very small administrative service. We have a very small MEA, and I am very conscious. I actually did the math about the number of foreign service officers at the end of each of your tenures as foreign secretaries. And the last number, if I quote, was 741 officers in the MEA when Mr. Menon stepped down as foreign secretary. This was 2009, that year, the annual report of that year, and today we have 941. So you've just increased 200 officers in about 9 years. When you that's practically, that increase is nothing for a country that wishes to be a global power. We have to raise capacity. We have to raise our internal strengths. We have to, there's no escaping the fact that we have to develop economically, and we have to actually be an, equality of opportunities for our citizens is extremely essential. We might have the numbers of 10%, but is that 10% affecting everybody equally? And that's the way we can be different from China. And if we can't achieve that, then we are forever condemned to be number 2, number 3. And I don't think that's our objective, is it? We want to be number 1. That's what this is all about.
Well, we have 6 minutes before we invite questions from the audience. So, yes, please.
I'm very touched by Jabin's faith in the foreign service. I don't think that's where. I think there are other things we need to do in India also, apart from what. Well, thank you. I'm flattered, I told you. No, but just to make the point, and I think Jabin's absolutely right, that ultimately we need to look at the India-China balance. And that is the core of this relationship. And it's not that you can do man-to-man marking with China. No, you're not going to be China tomorrow. You have other strengths, as he said, in soft power and so on. But I'm not sure that we quite understand that. And if anything, if you look at it, we've been bleeding soft power in the recent past. And that's a problem. That's a real problem. It's not that, if we are going to argue among ourselves about what kind of India we want, where are we going and so on, it's going to be that much more difficult for us to look outside. But today, both in India and in China and in many other places in the world, you have new authoritarian leadership which relies on ultra-nationalism and for its legitimacy. Because frankly, the capacity of governments to deliver has also gone down. So the promises have become bigger and bigger as they've gone on. And the result is a lessened capacity to actually negotiate, to make the compromises, to do the give and take that diplomacy or peaceful solutions to these issues requires. So systemically, globally, but this is especially true of both India and China, today you have much less capacity to do the compromises, to do the things, because you're also in an atmosphere where you drummed up nationalism and you claim to represent the flag. So it's much harder today to see some of these issues actually being resolved. And that, unfortunately, makes a new strategic framework much harder to arrive at.
I think this points to what we are experiencing these days, which is really dictator envy. Which is, I think, something which I think we should take very seriously, because rather than if you're talking about soft power, do we create democracy envy in other countries because India is such a flourishing democracy, or whether we all prey to dictator envy, which is what seems to have happened. So yes, it is very much a issue of what is the vision that you have of yourself, and I think we do have a somewhat confused vision today compared to the past. But let me also make the point that in terms of the structural challenges that we face, capacity, as Jabin mentioned, but at the end of the day, if you cannot address the asymmetry of power which has come to exist between India and China, and that asymmetry is still expanding, it is difficult to see how you can actually deal with the China challenge. I mean, that's the bottom line. If tomorrow you are able to start growing again at the rate of 9%, 10% per annum, if your capabilities on the economic side, your capabilities on the military side begin to expand, the situation will change. Perceptionally it will change, but also in terms of the reality of power between the two countries. So this is what needs to be addressed here, because if you want to get there, then sacrifices are required. I mean, you have to have a leadership which should be able to say, look, if we want to get there, merely saying that we want to get there is not going to make a difference. This is what we will need to do, and those kind of policies will require sacrifices, as I said. That is not happening. We can have it all. I don't think that is possible.
Well, now we'll turn to the audience for their questions and comments.